much for inviting me, and I'm happy to see quite a few people here. I'm very happy to present. Of course, I have been working on migratory birds for many years now, and I have a big interest in what goes on in Africa, actually. So quite some of this will have that focus. What is it that the birds that we see on northern latitudes are actually doing most of the time when they are in Africa? So I'll present some of that, and I hope that I can spark some interest in what I'm doing, and hopefully make people interested in collaborating and dispersing this kind of research much more widely. So yes, I'll talk about seasonal resource tracking in Afro-Palearctic and Intra-African migrations, and I hope it will become clear later on why there's also this focus on Intra-African migrations. But let's see what goes on here. I got stuck somehow. No. Yeah, so let's see what we have in the back. These long-tailed tits flying off, and this is the kind of research where you are like, where are the birds going? So there are many ways of doing this. These were just ringed, but one of the things that we are trying here is we're trying with different methods to actually track them much more actively. So first, this is about the going wild approach, where a lot of research in the past was done in labs or in only at one location, and the idea was to extend this to what actually does go on in the wild, where you somehow have to track the birds over longer distance to see what actually is happening. And some of this tracking started off with very much more simple, as you might know it, with planes and cars, and a lot of tough work. Here is a bat that requires a lot of night work, but nowadays there are somewhat more effective ways of doing this, but still some tracking does require lots of hours of working. The main focus here is on seasonal migration, and you probably all know this, with approximately 2 billion birds entering sub-Saharan Africa from northerly latitudes, but also migration going on all over the globe, more or less. So it's kind of an important phenomenon. A lot of biomass is actually being moved seasonally. So really seeing what's going on, I'd like to take you here to southeast Kenya in very early December, where you have the rains are starting, and it's quite a feast here for the baboons, with the termites are flying, and they'll find a lot of that. But the main thing, well, I should say here, the reason why the tourists are going there is because a leopard is being fed. Otherwise, it's actually not a very nice time for most of the tourists to be there, because there are so many insects when the rains are starting. But a lot of birds are also passing through there, and in these mist nets, 2 mist nets during the night, you can catch up to between 1,000 and 2,000 birds a night, and the majority of these are actually migrants, birds that will have bred in Europe. Here, marsh warblers to the left and thrush nightingales to the right. So really a spectacle, and a lot of birds passing through a very narrow corridor. And these are some of the mysteries that I always thought was really interesting. How can this actually work? And yes, so to try to get a more clear picture, follow individuals to see where do they come from, where do they go. One of the methods was geolocation, and still is, with light loggers, where you can find out where have a bird been, if you can recapture it. And the loggers, they measure light levels, so you can use that to get latitude and longitude, and it's a lot of nitty-gritty work. But after that, well, it's first of all, it can also be tough work, especially here with the strikes. So this is after a field season and a lot of bites, one of the collaborators. But what really came out of these first trackings were actually quite a surprise, a lot of details of how birds were migrating here from, on the left is thrush nightingales and on the right is red-backed shrikes, and fairly similar tracks, but also quite complicated annual schedules as such, with a lot of stops and quite differences in routes between spring and autumn. And here you can see for a thrush nightingale, just examples of strategies used by birds here. And you can see a thrush nightingale doesn't really have anywhere where it's staying for a very long time. It's moving on many times. It has slightly longer on the breeding grounds and on the southernmost wintering grounds, but each stay is obviously somehow important to it because it does stay there for quite a long time. And if we look at another species, just to say that this, not all species do this, here is shown for redstarts, where you have much more basically breeding and wintering separate, and migration is only a short commuting between breeding and wintering. And these might be more of niche switches than the other ones that are actually somehow able to follow at least something around. And even for those migrating the furthest, like here, icterine warblers, you can have a very short a rather short time on the breeding grounds. The main time for icterine warblers is actually spent here for the Danish ones. It was in Angola, more or less, and they spent almost half a year in Angola. The rest is migrating probably almost as fast as possible to the breeding areas. Then they breed and then they go back to wintering. So even the longest ones might have longer stays. So just to illustrate this variety of strategies, it's not easy to know when you look at a new species, how that one will be doing. And briefly also here, what's happening on those wintering grounds. Here was a kind of an odd example with the willow warblers, where the odd thing here is how widely dispersed they were during winter time. There was more than 3,000 kilometers from the easternmost to the westernmost wintering grounds, and with no apparent reason as such. And to briefly illustrate what I mean by no apparent reason, the lower figures, they show the NDVI and the greenness of these areas, and there is no obvious gain by going east or west. It's pretty much the same greenness. So it's not clear why birds would have this wide wintering range. But another important thing that happened to these willow warblers was that they are itinerant, so they do move during the winter time. And what should be possible to see from this is sort of, for instance, the red one here. When it starts here, it sees this greenness, and for all of them, it's decreasing greenness over time. But when it jumps, so they do move during the winter, and they jump up and get a higher NDVI when they jump. So somehow the decrease in NDVI, deteriorating conditions, they somehow change during the winter time. So this is another strategy. It's basically quite similar areas to where the redstarts are, but the redstarts, they stay all during the winter, whereas these willow warblers, they move. Why some species do one thing, another do another thing, it's still something that we would like to know much more about. But at least this is describing the differences between. If we now go back to another aspect that this migration studies have revealed, then for the red-backed shrikes here, we had a case in actually one of the first study years where we had these birds coming back. And as you can see here, it indicates that the timing, the first bird that arrived in Sweden of red-backed shrikes, it was a very late arrival in 2011. And the same for thrush nightingales, it was the latest ever in 2011. So for the first time, we were able to look at what is actually happening for these birds when they migrate. And this shows on the average of timing of where the birds are compared to normal years. And what you can see here is that the main thing happens here. The birds are getting delayed on the Horn of Africa. They arrive actually slightly before, but they departed way later in this year 2011. And if we look more into detail on the conditions in 2011, this area where they were stopping over, and basically there was this drought. It was very dry conditions, and humans were certainly suffering way more than birds in this time. But these conditions led the birds to depart up to 3 weeks later than they would normally do. So we see some very clear here carryover effects of those conditions, how something in Africa affected when the birds they arrived for breeding. There was no indication that they actually had fewer offspring that year, but still a clear indication how this can carry over among the different seasons and stages. Anyways, something that the geolocators they cannot provide is this thing that you can track birds and you can also get the birds that fail, which is something we're obviously interested in for knowing fitness consequences. With the geolocators, you have to retrap the birds. So those that fail, you will never see them. But with satellite tags, it's something else. And this is one of the largest nocturnal solitary migrants. That's the cuckoo, and the one shown here in the lower left, it's not eating this meadow pipit, but it's being fed by the meadow pipit. So cuckoos are interesting because they don't see their parents. They have to do all this migration on their own. So there's very little social interaction, at least that's what believed. So what happens to cuckoos needs somehow to be some interaction between the inborn migration program and the external environment, but not some social interactions. Maybe there'll be some, but that's still up for debate. So cuckoo tracking here shown. First you fit a tag and then you release the birds. This is now quite some time ago, and at least when the pictures were taken, they were still flying. So obviously that's important for being able to see where they go during winter time. And these were the tracks that came out of these the first trackings here. And the main thing you should see from this figure is just they did something very similar. There was very little variation among these 8 cuckoos that were tracked. And if we now ask what are these birds, what habitats do the migrants then exploit in Africa? Why is it that they go there, and what are the benefits that they get from that? And you can say, what are the benefits that they get from breeding in Europe as well? That's for these species as important. But here is shown the NDVI for each of these cells here in Africa, where you can see the variation over the year from January to December of the greenness and the normalized different vegetation index, which is just a measure of the greenness. And basically, if you look at those areas here, in this area, there is more greenness during in the northern winter, the southern summer, obviously here. And in this area here, you have more greenness during August, during the autumn here, and you have 2 peaks in those 2 areas. So they would be the areas to go to if you wanted to have more than the average. And we have calculated here the relative NDVI, where it's above the average and where it's below the average from January to December. So something you can use to look into what's are the benefits of being in a certain area at a certain time. So if we look now here, you see how the greenness is changing, and this is plotted here with these 3 species: cuckoos, thrush nightingales, and redback shrikes. It's indicated here. Blue is cuckoo, yellow is thrush nightingale, and the red is the shrikes. And you can somehow see that they move with here. Obviously, it gets much less green during the northern winter, and you can see the birds are moving down here. And we compared them with some simulated tracks, and the main conclusion from that, this is approximately latitudes traversed, is going back and forth. It's as far these birds go. And the main message here is that the cuckoos are they're getting more greenness than average, than well than random tracks, whereas the other ones are not doing good with that, but they're actually above with the relative or the peak NDVI. They get much more than random tracks. So they're optimizing that somehow, and for this means that the cuckoos are optimizing the greenness here, simply getting as much green vegetation as possible during the year, whereas nightingales and shrikes, they are optimizing the relative NDVI. More or less, you can say that they are getting, as they're surfing eternal summer, they're getting as much summer throughout the year, and that's obviously a bit of a task to get, and that means they have to travel almost all the time. So just comparing that for a thrush nightingale, that actually has quite constant relative NDVI compared to a redstart, where it's decreasing throughout the wintering stage. So quite a different strategy between those two species. Another point you could ask was why don't they just stay in Africa? And there was we did a study here on where we compared African cuckoos with common cuckoos, very similar species, not easy to tell apart. So the calls are slightly different, and they are possible to tell apart. Anyways, we were modeling that, and well, I should say we started with the tracking African cuckoos. Here is a team of people that were catching these, and here is Sola from Nigeria with an African cuckoo smiling. They weren't that easy to catch, I can say, but finally we managed to catch them, and we managed to get some tracks out of those. And perhaps the interesting, if you remember how the cuckoos, the common cuckoos tracks were, the interesting thing is this area, the common cuckoos were not. So they were more or less jumping over, leapfrogging over this area, you can say, where these actually the African cuckoos were. So it's not that this is not suitable habitat for cuckoos, it's just that that this is occupied perhaps by a different species than that. Anyways, we then use this to model the how much distribution there is for these species, and perhaps the interesting part was that during this time of the year, there is less habitat available for cuckoos in Africa, and there is quite some in Europe. So maybe that's part of the explanation for why they go to Europe during this part of the year. Another aspect from these migrants is that what actually happens during these glaciation cycles, and you probably have seen figures like this before with the temperature going back in time, and we are now in an interglacial warm period, but lots of historical or the past has been glaciation, but it's we have these glaciation cycles between warm periods and cold periods. So what has happened to the migrants? If you look at them here, a large part of where they are now, it was not possible, could not be occupied during glaciations. So it was interesting to try to see simply for a migrant like this with a complicated distribution flying around, what would actually happen when this bird, what could happen for a species like this in the past. And these are the main stopovers. So we were firstly modeling and full annual model. We were modeling the distribution, the current distribution. Here it's shown where you actually look at not only when a bird where birds are, but also when they are there, and taking looking at these differences. So taking the climate variables from when they were actually there, also at this monthly scale. And we then used this model that we were looking at before, where there was relative greenness was quite important, and that's we made a species distribution model with these four parameters in, and that's because those are the parameters that we actually have back in time. And with this model, we were able to quite nicely mirror the current distribution, where the birds here, they are during breeding. This is the area where they are during September and October. This is the area during winter, and you can probably see that these it fits quite well where the maximum, where the highest suitability is for those. And back in April and May, you have this area here becoming more green and more suitable for the birds. And that was important. This is the current distribution. If we then model this back in time, here it's shown how it looks during, this is the current situation with the most suitable habitat. And here you see how it was during the maximum glaciation 20,000 years ago. So redback shrikes had to retrace their distribution, their breeding distribution, but basically the wintering did not move very much. So these birds have likely been migrants throughout, and that's actually at that time during glaciations, redback shrikes might very well have been intra-African migrants rather than Afro-Palearctic migrants, but they were still migrants, and that's what it seems. It's a successful strategy to actually be a migrant that will hold during glaciation cycles, and obviously that's the birds that we see today, all the species, they have managed successfully many glacial cycles. And here you can see it's mainly the breeding. There's some variation in the stopovers, but the migration continues. It's mainly the breeding grounds that can expand further north. And just an example here showing this is the present. This is how it looked, the habitats 120,000 years ago. During the annual cycle, they are fairly similar. These are interglacials, whereas here is glacial cycles. You have a fairly similar pattern. So it's cycling back and forth between those with fairly similar distributions. Yes, but we still have to do some cuckoo tracking. And one of the things that was also interesting is how can this actually be done in cuckoos? How can a young cuckoo even manage to do something like this? That was Mikkel Willemoes with a young cuckoo, and the first attempts weren't very successful. Apparently, they couldn't manage to fly with those for a start. But we found another way here in Finland on red starts, nest boxes, where we could prevent the cuckoos from leaving the nest box too early, and it was fairly successful. Here you can see young cuckoos, and oddly enough, with the two migrating long distances over water shortly after having left the nest. Anyways, the main thing was probably this one, that we managed to have a cuckoo flying all the way to the African wintering grounds. And interestingly enough, these are tracks of adults that follow this, at least the Scandinavian ones were all following this clockwise loop pattern, but this one went straight. And young cuckoos are just really difficult to track. So we haven't been able to really find out whether this is whether they all do this or it's not so common. At least another thing that was interesting is that they were quite delayed. So overall, this is the young cuckoo, the red one, and the other ones are adult cuckoos. And generally, the adult cuckoos were before the young cuckoos. So it might indicate that they're not following adults on their way. It's also not known that they should be, and they shouldn't be able to recognize as such adults, but this indicates that they are migrating later on. Yes, something else that's interesting about the cuckoos, here was just a fun example when we tracked the first cuckoos. That was in 2010 and 2011. And this is from the birds of the Western Palearctic, the distribution map. And as you can see, the cuckoos wintered simply where it was shown that they were not wintering at all. So, and that has been typical when we track these birds. The knowledge based on whatever, who saw something at some point, can be not so accurate. And here it was clear that the main parts of cuckoos they're not wintering where they were thought to be. This has been modified, as you can see here. Now it's shown that they do winter there. But another aspect that's interesting perhaps is that the cuckoos are distributed all the way to the very far east here of Siberia and Asia. And we thought that was interesting to know, is that really so, that these cuckoos go all the way to Africa? So I went there together with some Russian colleagues, and you might not see it very clearly, but there is a very big brown bear there. This is really bear country. It's very wild. country, but it's also fairly easy. You can fly. This is a 9 hours domestic flight from Moscow, so you simply land right into very good cuckoo habitat. So we went almost straight for fieldwork. There's some special bird fauna there and some hot springs, and as I mentioned, there are quite some bears. So this bear spray was important. I don't think it worked, but we luckily didn't have to test that. But anyways, after that, you catch cuckoos and you fit the transmitters, and that's what was done here. And these 4 cuckoos were then released, and then you go to your office and wait. And the first tracks we saw were these, after waiting quite some time, these tracks. And the fun thing is that you don't see the end of these tracks, so you turn the globe. And then you think you see the tracks, but you still don't see the tracks. So 3 times you have, and then you realize that these birds, they are going from Kamchatka to the other side of Earth, and simply they were wintering in Namibia in very different conditions. And that's they were passing some. This seemed to be a piece of cake to actually cross the Indian Ocean here from India. This bird actually did not stop even after it entered land. It continued and only made a stop after having traveled quite a bit further. So it doesn't seem to be a big task for these. They are flying very fast. So these tracks are they are quite long, as is probably obvious here. This is a displacement distance of 15,000 kilometers. So it's Australia to north to London or something like this in that order. So obviously it's something that's odd. How do they manage to, how can they even know that it would be good to go to the other side of Earth? And just to put that in perspective, well, Arctic Terns is maybe 16,000 kilometers displacement distance. So it's a very similar distance to the longest. And this is clearly the longest land bird migration. None of the other ones here come. This one comes slightly close. It's willow warblers, and obviously they're smaller, but still they're not doing nearly as far, also because they take the Great Circle routes. Anyways, tracking is a major issue, and it would be nice to get a better understanding of what's going on with a lot of this. And as you probably know, it's easy enough with whales and elephants that they can carry large tags, but when it comes to small birds, it's still fairly difficult. There are now Doppler satellite tracks that go down to 2 grams, but few people are using them, and they're still super expensive. So there are some issues still with actually having this used much more widely, of course. And one of the things we were very happy to succeed with was launching an antenna that was mounted on the International Space Station, and that worked for a while. Now this collaboration with Russia doesn't work anymore, but we are working hard to actually get something similar. But during the time that it worked, we had to track or try to track a lot of cuckoos. This was one of the way of catching cuckoos in these Heligoland traps, and that was possible with both adults and young cuckoos here being tagged in these huge nets. And with that, a lot of effort, we were able to fill out some more of the holes of these the cuckoos, more or less tracking common cuckoos. All these are tracks from the BTO, and there are tracks here from Korea and from many different collaborators, but also these were Icarus tags that we were able to attach and get birds tracked from these areas. So really, cuckoos from all over the world, common cuckoos from all over the world, are all gathering together in Africa, which really seems like an interesting and crazy migration system from these many different areas. Anyways, just a few notes on conservation and management of migratory birds, and this is obviously something that is very that needs some focus. How do we deal with this? There is a lot of land use change, and how can migratory birds deal with this? I would say that they are probably quite good at dealing with climate change, because they have done this in many times in the past. But how to actually deal with the land use change is perhaps much more of an issue, and this obviously requires. Well, I should say here is just a figure showing that it's in general migrants are declining. At least those Afro-Palearctic migrants are to a large degree declining. So this here is an indication, and I think I saw Chris here also with the showing that for the UK cuckoos there is a difference in the flyways, so that's the migration routes might actually affect survival. But obviously, work on the African wintering grounds is also important. And here we were tracking the migrants in Ghana to see how do they exploit. Obviously, it would be nice if these were actually doing some good for the farmers or something that we can. But basically, they were not very much attached to important crops, but they were perhaps more victims as such for all the tree felling in this area. Anyways, yeah, just to show this is how supervisors work. They don't have to do it's. We need other people to do the hard work, and we were watching elephants at the same time. But that was one of the elephants. But also to say this is something I think really needs to be democratized. This is work on black cuckoos, to look also at intra-African migrants here with satellite transmitters. Something that is actually and should hopefully be soon becoming cheaper and much more readily available, so that more people can actually can do this. And that's the hope. This project was training Nigerian people in tagging birds, so it's hopefully something that can be done much more like that if it becomes hopefully cheaper and more readily available. I think this is a big opportunity for people to actually start using this. And anyways, yeah, I'm working on a lot of species. Also, these are golden eagles being tagged in Denmark, and that has actually meant that now they start surviving, because before I guess they were shot and nobody knew. Now people know, so it also has that benefit. There's been a lot of conservation people that didn't want tracking of those birds because they thought it would impact them negatively, but it has turned out that it's actually impacting them positively, because now we know. So apparently nobody dares shoot them when they see they have something on. So it was quite nice like that. The other thing that's the hope is that we can extend this much further. This is work in the Ural Mountains, and that's I assume for a long time will be off limits. This white thrush is was tracked to Mongolia, most likely wintering in Southeast or Asia or Southeast China. But this is work that I think is very nice. Simply that description of where do these long distance migrants go and what is the variation, and then trying to find out what's causing it. And with that, it's now the locust in the top is still for the future. But I also think that it's nice that there are many people interested in this, and here is just local starlings let go by a group of people. But I think this is how this can work. Many more people being involved in it and interested in it, and it's certainly something that we can do much more. At least what we have learned so far, I believe, is quite a bit. I think simply mapping what's going on is really an important task we have ahead of us. So yes, that's what I have. That's what I had, and I'll just say yeah, thank you. And
Bonjour à tous, hi everyone. Alors je vais faire un petit résumé rapide de cet incroyable résumé du travail de Kasper Thorup sur le suivi des ressources saisonnières par les migrateurs afro-paléarctiques et les migrateurs intra-africains. Donc Kasper Thorup est de l'Université de Copenhague, responsable de la station de bagages de Copenhague et du musée zoologique et d'histoire naturelle du Danemark. Donc, Kasper a commencé par un petit résumé des méthodes qui sont disponibles pour suivre les migrateurs. Donc, ça a commencé avec la télémétrie et le bagage des migrateurs, puis l'apparition des géolocalisateurs, et avec des exemples. Donc, la pigrièche écorcheur, par exemple, qui suit les ressources pendant l'hiver en Afrique de l'Est, alors que le rouge-queue à front blanc, lui, semble rester sur le même site d'hivernage tout au long de l'hiver boréal. On a vu aussi l'exemple de l'Hipola essictérine qui fait une migration en boucle avec un site d'hivernage de près de 6 mois entre la Namibie et l'Angola. Euh, Ensuite, l'exemple des Pouillophytis qui sont itinérants, qui font des déplacements longitudinaux, donc apparemment aussi en fonction du développement de la végétation. On a vu ensuite qu'en Suède, les pygèches écorcheurs et les Pouillophytis ont vu leur date d'arrivée évoluer au fil des années. Euh, il y a eu ensuite un exemple sur l'effet de la sécheresse en Afrique de l'Est sur les migrateurs, avec l'exemple de la pygèche écorcheur et du rossignol prunier, ce qui explique peut-être aussi pourquoi ces espèces sont itinérantes en hiver pour pouvoir être plus flexibles avec les changements interannuels de précipitations. Ensuite, il a été question des limitations de la géolocalisation. On n'a pas d'informations sur les oiseaux qui ne reviennent pas, donc ça résulte en un biais de ces études. On a des informations seulement sur les oiseaux qui ont réussi à accomplir 2 migrations avec succès, donc, et à revenir sur leur site de reproduction. Et grâce au suivi satellitaire qui est de plus en plus disponible pour les plus petits oiseaux, ça permet de pallier à cette limitation. Et par exemple, pour des oiseaux comme le coucou gris qui sont quand même de plus grande taille, ça devient possible de le suivre par satellite. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup d'exemples sur le coucou gris qui a été étudié très en détail, avec des individus qui se sont déplacés au sein de l'Afrique de l'Ouest pendant l'hiver. Euh, Ensuite, des comparaisons entre le coucou africain et le coucou gris. Donc, le coucou africain migre sur de beaucoup plus courtes distances au sein de la même région en Afrique. La question, c'est pourquoi les coucous gris, eux, feraient le déplacement jusqu'en Europe. Donc, forcément, il y a moins d'habitats disponibles durant l'été boréal en Afrique qu'en Europe. Donc, c'est pour profiter de ces ressources que les coucous font cette migration. Ensuite, on a vu l'effet des glaciations sur la migration, et c'est forcément des migrations qui ont évolué avec ces périodes glaciaires. L'aire de nidification des migrateurs était en grande partie inutilisable durant les périodes glaciaires, donc de nouveau avec l'exemple de la pygèche écorcheur. Et la pygèche écorcheur, donc selon des modélisations, était apparemment une espèce essentiellement africaine qui faisait des migrations entre le Sahel et l'Afrique australe durant les périodes glaciaires. Le coucou, retour au coucou gris, donc, avec l'exemple de juvéniles aussi qui ont été capturés et qui sont partis en Afrique plus tard que les adultes. On a ensuite parlé des aires d'hivernage des coucous qui, grâce aux travaux de l'équipe de Kasper Thorup, on a pu se rendre compte que l'aire d'hivernage n'était pas estimée correctement, qu'on avait des présences dans les zones de forêt équatoriale ou subéquatoriale d'Afrique de l'Ouest où il n'était pas attendu comme hivernant. Ensuite, c'est peut-être l'exemple le plus impressionnant qui a été présenté dans cette présentation, c'est des coucous gris qui rejoignent la Namibie depuis le Kamtchatka, donc un voyage de près de 15 000 km, dont 3 800 km pour certains individus au-dessus de l'océan Indien. C'est plus de distance, par exemple, au-dessus de l'océan que ce que font les trachémoteux qui viennent depuis le Groenland jusqu'en Europe. On a ensuite des exemples du Pouillophytis qui font aussi des migrations assez similaires. Et ensuite, on est revenu au coucou, donc avec les gains de la migration vers l'Afrique. Les coucous qui ont une distance de migration plus longue vers l'Asie ont un gain en NDVI, donc en développement de la végétation, qui est plus important comparé à ceux qui viennent depuis l'Europe. Donc ça explique pourquoi ils feraient cette plus longue migration. Et ensuite, enfin, la comparaison entre le coucou gris et le coucou oriental, qui sont deux espèces assez proches en fonction des périodes glaciaires. Je ne vais peut-être pas donner tous les détails de ces résultats, mais il faut juste retenir que le coucou oriental reste en Asie et fait donc des migrations plus courtes. Et c'est une espèce proche qui se serait séparée du coucou gris il y a entre 2 et 500 000 ans. Après tous ces exemples impressionnants, on a parlé plutôt de la conservation des migrateurs face aux changements environnementaux. Les migrateurs afro-paléarctiques sont généralement en déclin. Il y a aussi une étude qui a été présentée sur les effets des coupes de bois sur les migrateurs et les services écosystémiques rendus par les migrateurs, par exemple au Ghana. Ensuite, encore un travail de suivi de satellites sur les coucals. Et finalement, l'exemple de l'aigle royal au Danemark avec un impact positif du tracking qui permet de réduire le cas de braconnage. Et la conclusion de ce résumé magnifique, la conclusion de ce travail, c'était donc qu'il est important d'impliquer aussi un maximum de personnes dans le suivi des migrateurs pour sensibiliser les gens à la problématique et améliorer la conservation de ces espèces. Merci beaucoup.